The night was colder than anyone remembered. Snow swallowed the street, the trees, the silence. Inside a small wooden house, a little girl pressed her hands together, trying to warm them when she heard it. A sound, so weak it almost blended into the storm. A cry. She opened the door just a crack and felt the cold punch her face. On the steps sat two dogs, frozen in place. Their fur was stiff with ice. Icicles hung from their ears and paws. One could barely lift its head. The other didn't move at all. She knew she wasn't allowed. She knew it could get her in trouble. But when one dog slowly collapsed into the snow, she didn't think about rules anymore. She thought about life. She pulled them inside, wrapped them in blankets, sat with them all night. By morning, she expected silence. Instead, she woke to sirens. Police cars, flashing lights, armed officers surrounding her house. And that's when she realized saving them had triggered something far bigger than she ever imagined. Before we start, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe. And really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The storm had arrived without warning, swallowing the neighborhood in white. Snow piled high against doors and windows, and the wind howled like something alive, rattling old fences and frozen trees. Streetlights flickered through the snowfall, their glow weak and distant, as if even the light was struggling to survive the cold. It was the kind of night where everything stayed hidden, or disappeared forever. Inside the small house, the little girl sat curled on the couch, wrapped in a thin blanket. The heater hummed softly, fighting a losing battle against the freezing air that seeped through every crack. She lived quietly here, in a world that felt much bigger and colder than it should have. No siblings running through the halls. No laughter echoing from other rooms. Just silence, broken only by the storm outside. She stared at the window, watching snowflakes race each other toward the ground. Her mind wandered, as it often did on nights like this. She thought about school, about the empty seat beside her, about how the world felt kinder in her imagination than it did in real life. Outside, the wind grew stronger, pushing snow into corners where it stacked higher and higher. Anyone caught out there wouldn't last long. The temperature had dropped dangerously low, the kind of cold that stiffened fingers in minutes and stole breath with every inhale. Even animals knew better than to wander in weather like this. At least that's what she believed. She pulled the blanket tighter on her shoulders and leaned back, trying to ignore the strange unease settling in her chest. The storm raged on, relentless and unforgiving, wrapping the night in ice and silence. And somewhere beyond those walls, something was waiting quietly, desperately for someone to notice. At first, she thought it was the wind. A long, low sound slipping through the cracks of the night, blending with the storm. She shifted on the couch, pulling the blanket higher, telling herself not to imagine things. Storms made strange noises. Everyone knew that. Then she heard it again. Shorter this time, softer, almost like it was running out of strength. She sat up slowly, her heart beginning to beat faster. The sound wasn't coming from the trees or the road. It was closer, right outside. She held her breath, listening hard, afraid that if she moved, it might disappear. Another sound followed, barely a whimper. Her feet touched the cold floor as she stood. She tiptoed toward the front door, each step careful, as if the house itself might scold her for being awake. She pressed her ear against the wood. The noise was clearer now, weak, broken. Not the wind. Not the storm. Her hand hovered over the door handle. Fear crept in, sharp and sudden. She remembered the warnings. Don't open the door at night. Don't talk to strangers. Don't let fear trick you into danger. But then she looked through the small window. Two shapes sat on the steps, barely visible beneath the snow. As her eyes adjusted, her breath caught in her throat. Two dogs. Their fur was coated in ice, icicles hanging from their ears and chests. One trembled violently. The other struggled to stay upright, its legs shaking beneath its weight. Their eyes met hers. Not wild, not angry. Just tired. One let out a final, weak cry and slowly sank into the snow. Her hand tightened around the door handle, then froze. Every rule she had ever learned rushed back into her mind at once. Don't open the door after dark. Don't bring animals inside. Don't make decisions without an adult. Rules were meant to keep her safe. Rules were meant to stop bad things from happening. She stepped back, her heart pounding hard enough to hurt. Outside, the wind screamed louder, pushing snow across the steps. The dogs didn't move. They didn't bark or scratch or beg. They simply waited, as if they already knew what would happen if she walked away. She whispered to herself that someone else would find them. A neighbor. An animal rescue. Anyone but her. She told herself she was too small, too young, too scared to help. The cold pressed against the glass, unforgiving and final. Then one of the dogs tried to stand. Its legs slipped. Its body sagged. It collapsed again, curling into itself as if giving up took less strength than holding on. Something inside her broke. She thought about how quiet the night was, about how no one else was watching, about how the storm didn't care about rules or age or fear. It only took what it could. Her hands shook as she pulled the door open. Cold air rushed in, biting her face, stealing her breath. She dropped to her knees and wrapped her arms around the nearest dog. Its fur was like ice. Too cold. Dangerously cold. I won't leave you, she whispered, her voice trembling. She pulled with everything she had, dragging both dogs across the threshold. The doors slammed shut behind them. In that moment, she didn't know she had crossed a line. She only knew she had saved 2 lives. The house felt warmer the moment the door closed. But the dogs were still shaking violently. She dragged every blanket she could find from the couch and her bedroom, layering them carefully on the floor. Her fingers burned as they touched the dog's frozen fur, the cold seeping straight into her skin. She rubbed their sides gently, whispering soft words she hoped they could understand. The smaller dog lifted its head just enough to look at her. Its eyes followed her movements, slow and tired, but aware. The larger one barely moved at all, its chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Fear twisted in her stomach. She didn't know what to do, only that stopping now wasn't an option. She ran to the kitchen and filled a bowl with water, setting it nearby. Then she grabbed slices of bread and tore them into small pieces, placing them carefully beside the blankets. "It's okay," she murmured, over and over, like a promise she couldn't afford to break. The words steadied her, even if nothing else did. Slowly the shaking eased. Not completely, but enough that she noticed it. One dog shifted closer, pressing its body against her leg. The warmth surprised her. The trust surprised her even more. She froze, afraid to scare them, then gently rested her hand on its back. It didn't pull away. Time seemed to stretch. The storm outside continued to howl, but inside, something softer settled in. The dog's breathing grew steadier. Their eyes stayed on her, never leaving, as if memorizing the face of the person who chose them when no one else did. She sat on the floor between them, back against the couch, blankets piled high. Exhaustion crept in, heavy and unavoidable. Before her eyes closed, she felt one dog rest its head against her knee. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to believe they might survive. Sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound made her open her eyes again, the wind against the walls, the heater clicking, the faint shift of fur beneath the blankets. She kept checking the dogs, pressing her ear close to hear their breathing, afraid it might stop if she looked away too long. The storm outside felt endless, like the night itself refused to move on. She whispered stories to them to stay awake. About school, about dreams she never said out loud, about how scary the world felt sometimes. The dogs didn't understand the words, but they stayed close, their bodies slowly growing warmer. One lifted its head and licked her hand weakly, a small gesture that made her chest ache. Hours passed. Snow stacked higher against the windows. The cold tried to force its way back inside, but the blankets held. The dogs trembled less now, their breathing deeper, steadier. She noticed the change and smiled for the first time since the storm began. At some point, exhaustion won. Her eyes closed, her head resting against the couch. She slept sitting up, one hand still touching fur, afraid to let go even in dreams. The dogs stayed awake longer than she did, ears flicking at every sound, guarding her in return. The storm slowly softened. The wind lost its sharp edge. Snow fell quieter, gentler, as if the night itself was finally calming down. Inside, 3 small hearts kept beating, stubborn and determined. When morning light began to creep through the window, pale and fragile, the little girl stirred. She didn't know what the day would bring. She only knew she had made it through the night, and outside, unseen, something else was already on its way. The sound tore through her sleep, like a scream, sharp, sudden, unforgiving. Sirens. Her eyes flew open as red and blue lights flashed across the walls, painting the room in violent colors. For a moment, she didn't know where she was or what she had done. Then she felt the warmth beside her. The dogs, both awake now, both alert. Outside, engines idled. Doors slammed. Voices carried through the cold morning air. Not calm voices, urgent ones. She scrambled to her feet, heart pounding so hard it made her dizzy. The smaller dog pressed close to her leg, trembling again, but this time, not from cold. The larger one stood, placing itself between her and the door, its body tense, ears high. The knocking came next. Not gentle, not patient, a hard, authoritative pounding that shook the door in its frame. "Police!" A voice called out. "Open the door!" Her breath caught in her throat. Police? Why would the police be here? Her mind raced through the night, bringing the dogs inside, hiding them, breaking the rules. Fear wrapped around her chest, tight and suffocating. She backed away from the door instinctively. Outside, neighbors were gathering, pulled from their homes by the lights and noise. Curtains twitched. Phones were raised. Whispers spread. The pounding came again, louder this time. "Open the door immediately." The dogs reacted instantly. One let out a low warning growl, not aggressive, but protective. The other stayed glued to her side, eyes locked on the door like it was a threat. Tears filled her eyes. She hadn't meant to do anything wrong. She had only tried to help, only tried to save them. Her hands shook as she reached for the handle. Behind that door waited flashing lights, uniforms, and questions she didn't know how to answer. And as she turned the lock, she had no idea that the dog she rescued had brought something far bigger to her doorstep than trouble. The door creaked open, just enough for cold air to rush inside. A line of police officers stood on the porch, their breath visible, their faces serious. Flashing lights reflected off the snow, turning the quiet street into something tense and unreal. The little girl stood frozen, her hands clenched at her sides, her heart pounding too loudly to ignore. "Step back, please," an officer said, his voice firm, but not unkind. She obeyed instantly, taking a small step away from the doorway. The dogs moved with her, staying close, their bodies stiff and watchful. One officer noticed them and raised his hand slightly, signaling the others to stay calm. "What's going on?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. No one answered right away. The officers exchanged looks, their eyes moving from the girl to the dogs, then back again. Something wasn't adding up. Behind them, neighbors crowded the sidewalk, murmuring softly. Some looked curious. Others looked worried. Phones were lifted, recording everything. The little girl felt suddenly exposed, like the entire world was watching her breathe. An officer crouched down to her level. "Did you bring these dogs inside last night?" he asked carefully. Her throat tightened. She nodded once, slowly. Fear twisted in her stomach as she waited for him to say she was in trouble. The dogs reacted immediately. One stepped forward, placing its body between her and the officer. The other pressed against her leg, eyes sharp, alert. A low sound rumbled from its chest, not anger, but warning. The officers froze. Hands hovered near their belts, tension snapping through the air. The girl's eyes filled with tears. "Please," she said, shaking. They were freezing. I didn't know what else to do. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then one officer straightened, his expression shifting from suspicion to something else entirely. Concerned. And that was when everything began to change. The officer slowly stood, his eyes never leaving the dogs. His jaw tightened, not with anger, but with recognition. He turned slightly, speaking into the radio clipped to his shoulder in a low voice. The words were quiet, urgent, and filled with disbelief. Whatever he was saying made the other officers straighten instantly. The little girl felt her knees weaken. Recognition? That wasn't supposed to be possible. These were just two freezing dogs she'd found in the snow. Nothing more. Nothing dangerous. Her fingers curled into the fabric of her sleeve as she waited, her heart racing. "Sweetheart," the officer said gently, lowering himself again. "Do you know what kind of dogs these are?" She shook her head, confused. "They're not strays," he continued. "And they're not lost pets." One officer stepped forward, removing his gloves despite the cold. He studied the dogs closely, their posture, their alert eyes, the way they moved in perfect awareness of the room. His expression hardened. "These are trained," he said quietly. "Highly trained." A ripple of tension moved through the group. Radios crackled. One officer walked the perimeter of the house, scanning the surroundings. Another glanced toward the street, as if expecting something or someone to appear. The girl's breath hitched. "Did I do something wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I didn't know." "I swear." "No," the first officer said quickly. "You didn't do anything wrong." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But these dogs went missing during a serious situation last night. A situation that put a lot of people in danger." The room felt suddenly smaller. The dogs shifted, standing taller now, calmer but alert, like they understood every word being spoken. They were part of an active operation. The officer continued. "And when we couldn't find them, we feared the worst." He looked at the girl again, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You didn't just bring dogs inside last night. You may have saved lives." One of the officers slowly knelt in front of the larger dog, careful not to startle it. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small handheld scanner, the kind the girl had never seen before. The device beeped once as it passed near the dog's shoulder, then again louder this time. The officer exhaled sharply. "There it is," he said under his breath. He gently brushed aside the dog's fur, revealing a thin, embedded tag just beneath the skin. Another officer did the same with the second dog. Both scanners reacted instantly. The mood on the porch shifted in seconds from uncertainty to shock. "These are confirmed," one officer said into his radio. "Both of them." The girl stared, confused and frightened. "Confirmed what?" she asked, her voice small. The officer turned back to her, his expression softening. "These dogs are elite K9 units," he explained carefully. "They're trained to assist in dangerous operations, tracking, protection, detection. They don't belong to anyone in this neighborhood." Around them, radios crackled to life. Voices spoke quickly, urgently, overlapping with instructions and updates. A few officers stepped back, scanning the street again, suddenly alert to every movement. Another officer removed his hat, rubbing his forehead in disbelief. "We thought they'd been taken," he said quietly. "Or worse." The dogs stood calmly now, as if the tension no longer belonged to them. They stayed close to the girl, one leaning lightly against her leg. She reached down without thinking, resting her hand on its head. It didn't move away, so. "They're not in trouble?" she asked, tears slipping free. One officer shook his head. "No," he said firmly. "They're heroes." He looked down at the dogs with new respect. "They went missing during an operation involving armed suspects. When the storm hit, we lost their trail completely. We've been searching all night." The girl's chest tightened. The thought of these dogs out there alone hurt. Hunted made her stomach twist. "And if you hadn't brought them inside," the officer continued quietly, "they wouldn't have survived the night." A heavy silence followed. The flashing lights still filled the street. But now they meant something different. They weren't here to accuse her. They were here because what she had done mattered more than anyone could have imagined. One of the senior officers stepped forward, his voice low and controlled, as if the wrong volume might bring the danger back. He explained that the night before, those two dogs had been part of a coordinated operation on the edge of town. Armed suspects. A hidden location. A situation already spiraling out of control before the storm ever arrived. The dogs had been sent ahead to search a deserted property believed to be a temporary hideout. Inside, they detected something that didn't belong: explosives, weapons, signs that someone was preparing to run. Before officers could secure the area, gunfire erupted. Chaos followed. In the confusion, the suspects fled into the storm. When the snow came down hard and fast, visibility dropped to nothing. Radio signals weakened. Tracks vanished beneath fresh ice within minutes. And in that whiteout, the dogs broke away, not in panic, but in instinct. They didn't run blindly. They ran to survive. The officer paused, swallowing hard. "Those suspects were desperate," he said. "If they'd found the dogs first, it wouldn't have ended well." The girl felt her stomach drop. She looked down at the dogs, suddenly seeing them differently. Not just cold and tired, but brave, strong, determined. They had escaped danger she couldn't even imagine, pushed through a storm that should have killed them, and kept moving until their bodies couldn't go any further. Another officer added quietly, "They likely chose your house because it was the last light they saw." That thought struck her deeper than fear ever could. Out of all the dark, frozen places in the world, they had found her. The dogs stood silently as the officers spoke, ears flicking at familiar words, calm but alert. They weren't afraid anymore. They were home, at least for now. The storm saved them, the senior officer said. It forced the suspects to retreat. He looked at the girl, his voice softening. "But you saved them." The weight of that truth settled heavily in the air. What had begun as a quiet act of kindness had become the final link in a chain that stopped something far worse from happening. And none of them would ever forget it. The truth hit her all at once, heavy and impossible to ignore. These dogs didn't belong to her. They never had. They were trained, needed, important. The uniforms, the radios, the way the officers watched them with respect, it all pointed to one thing. The dogs would be leaving. Her chest tightened as the thought settled in. She looked down at them, at the same dogs she had wrapped in blankets just hours earlier. The ones who had trusted her enough to sleep beside her through the storm. The idea of letting go felt worse than the cold ever had. "So, you're taking them?" she asked quietly, her voice barely steady. The officers exchanged looks. No one answered right away. That silence told her everything. Tears filled her eyes. She dropped to her knees and hugged the dogs tightly, burying her face into their warm fur. "I'm sorry," she whispered, again and again. "I didn't know. I just didn't want you to die." The dogs reacted instantly. One stood over her protectively, placing its body between her and the officers. The other pressed its head against her shoulder, letting out a low, steady sound that felt like comfort. They refused to move. Refused to be separated. An officer stepped forward slowly. "Easy," he said gently, raising his hands. "We're not here to hurt anyone." But the dogs didn't listen. They stayed locked in place, eyes sharp, muscles tense, not aggressive, but determined. The bond between them and the girl was undeniable now, stretching beyond training, beyond commands. The girl looked up through her tears. "Please," she said, her voice breaking. "They need me. And I need them." For the first time since arriving, the officers hesitated, not because of danger, but because of something far more complicated. This wasn't just a recovery anymore. It was a question of the heart, and whatever decision came next would change all of their lives forever. Street had gone quiet in a way no one expected. Radios fell silent. Officers lowered their hands. The tension that had arrived with flashing lights slowly melted into something heavier: understanding. One by one, they watched the girl and the dogs, no longer seeing a problem to solve, but a moment they couldn't ignore. A senior officer stepped forward, his voice softer now. "I've worked with K9 units for over 20 years, he said. "I've never seen dogs act like this without a reason." His eyes moved from the dogs to the girl. "They chose her." Another officer nodded, crouching to observe how the dogs stayed close but calm, alert yet trusting. Their training was still there, sharp, controlled, but layered over it was something deeper: loyalty, gratitude, connection. She didn't just shelter them, one officer said quietly. She kept them alive. The girl listened in silence, tears drying on her cheeks. She hadn't thought of herself as brave or special. She had only done what felt right in the moment. But now, surrounded by uniforms and flashing lights, her small choice was being seen for what it truly was. One of the officers slowly reached out a hand toward the larger dog. It didn't flinch. It didn't growl. It glanced at the girl first, as if asking permission, then allowed the touch. That single action said more than words ever could. "These dogs trust her," the senior officer said. "And dogs like this don't give trust easily." A decision was forming, unspoken but powerful. The officers exchanged looks that carried weight. Responsibility and compassion, whatever rules existed, whatever procedures demanded, the situation had crossed into something human. Finally, the senior officer straightened and spoke with certainty. "We're going to do this the right way," he said. And for the first time since the sirens began, hope quietly entered the space between them all. The senior officer stepped aside with two others, their voices low, serious. Procedures were discussed, protocols mentioned. But every few seconds, their eyes drifted back to the girl and the dogs, still pressed together like they belonged that way. What was written in manuals didn't account for moments like this. Finally, the officer returned, kneeling in front of her. "You did something extraordinary," he said. "You broke no law. You followed your heart." Her breath caught as she waited for the rest. "These dogs will need medical care and evaluation," he continued. "But what happens after that isn't so simple." One of the handlers arrived then, snow still clinging to his jacket. The moment the dogs saw him, their ears lifted, but they didn't run to him. They stayed with her. The handler stopped short, stunned. "I've trained them since they were pups," he whispered. "I've never seen this." He knelt, speaking softly to the dogs. They listened, calm and steady, but when he gestured for them to come, they hesitated. One glanced back at the girl. The handler swallowed hard. "They're choosing," he said quietly. The officer nodded. "Then we listen." The decision came gently, but it landed heavy. The dogs would return to service after recovery, but this girl would never be forgotten. She would be recognized for her courage. And when the time came for these dogs to retire, there would be a home waiting for them. Her eyes widened. You mean, one day? She asked. The officer smiled. One day. Because heroes deserve to choose where they belong. The dogs pressed closer, as if they understood the promise being made. As the sun rose higher, the flashing lights shut off. The storm had passed, and in its place stood something warmer than rules or uniforms. Compassion. And it had changed everything. Days later, the house felt different. Quieter but warmer in a way the heater could never manage. Fresh snow still covered the yard, but the storm was only a memory now. The little girl stood by the window, watching sunlight reflect off the ice. Her thoughts drifting back to that night and everything it had changed. The dogs were gone, recovering under careful watch, but they hadn't truly left her. Their presence lingered in every blanket folded on the couch, every quiet corner of the room. She replayed the moments again and again, the cries in the dark, the choice she made, the sirens at dawn. She finally understood something she hadn't before. Kindness doesn't ask for permission. A letter arrived later that week. Inside were a few simple words from the officers, thanking her for bravery she never knew she had. There was a photo, two dogs standing strong again, alert and proud. On the back, a message was written just for her. They're safe because of you. Tears filled her eyes as she smiled. She hadn't saved them to be a hero. She hadn't expected police lights or praise or promises. She had only listened to her heart when the world was cold, and that was enough. Somewhere across town, two dogs rested with new strength, carrying with them the memory of a small house, a warm floor, and a girl who refused to look away. One day, they would return not as rescue dogs, not as heroes, but as family. Until then, the girl carried the lesson with her everywhere she went, that even the smallest hands can hold the biggest courage, that kindness, given in silence, can echo louder than sirens. And that sometimes, when you open your door to save someone else, you end up changing your own life forever.